listening to the Power of Inspiration and Awakening Radio with Julia Griffin. To master a higher frequency for a new state of mind. Once you walked in a forest of splendor in which everything you did and everything you thought was aligned. It is possible at this time to begin to return to the old knowledge. Intuitive healer and manifester Julia Griffin is here to talk about this unique time in history when all sentient beings, animals, plants, trees, and the earth are intent on creating this change. The wolves awakened her to the most incredible light, which opened gifts and brought knowledge that she longs to share. You are creators, and you are born to be creators of beauty, possibility, and joy. Join Julia on a journey into a beautiful and magical world where amazing possibilities exist. Let us help open the door. The Power of Inspiration and Awakening with Julia Griffin starts right now.
Hello, everyone. I'm Julia Griffin, and you're listening to The Power of Inspiration and Awakening on Transformation Talk Radio. Stay with us for the next hour, and let us help you experience a higher vibration and a new state of mind. Part of how we get into a new state of mind is by discussing things that we're not familiar with and doing it in an open way. And the conversation that we're going to have today with our guest, Keith Thompson, is about UFOs. So come into it with an open mind and really think about what you believe and what you might want to open to. And for those of you who are not familiar with me, I actually awakened with wolves. When I first met a real wolf, it talked to me just the same way that people talk, same way you're hearing my voice. Over a period of time, I learned to hear what people were thinking, plants and all animals. I intuitively hear this, and I try to help people find their inner self and the path of their soul. So let me tell you about today's guest and the fun we're going to have discussing something of great debate. He is an author, independent journalist, talk radio host, former TV talk show host, and former U.S. Senate staff member. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, Esquire, San Francisco Chronicle, Idaho Statesman, and the Pacific Sun. He lives in northern Florida, and today he will speak to us about his new book, The UFO Paradox, and there's certainly many paradoxes implied in this. And you can find him at www.thompsonatlarge.com. So welcome, Keith. I'm so happy to have you with us today.
Well, thank you, Julie. It's great to be here. If I could give one thought in response to what you put out, to those of you who hear, those of you, your listeners and viewers who have just heard the phrase UFO, and whether they intend it or not, they have a bunch of associations. We're going to talk about, I'm going to learn more about what I already know. Well, why don't you take what I already know, put it on the table. It'll still be there after the show, and you may find out you'll learn something new. I say that because the UFO phrase and this UFO subject evokes all the things we are pretty sure we already know about what's possible, what it could be, can't be, should be, must be. And I have learned to put many of my own assumptions aside as a researcher who went deeply into the evidence. Follow the evidence where it leads, will lead you beyond your belief systems.
And let's go a little deeper with that. People always say, I do your exercises, I study with you. Why am I not having these peak experiences and breakthroughs that you're having? Well, part of it is being open-minded. With almost everything that I've ever studied or worked on, while I had a good idea of what I thought and what I felt, it expanded, changed, and rearranged itself over time. And that really is how you get into the more spiritual world and learn to make the logical, analytical part of your mind and the intuitive part of your mind work together, which is the whole reason for doing all this in my mind.
I'm 100% with you on that. And I have found out for myself through my various phases of spiritual practice that sometimes the very effort to practice is what prevents opening. It's an ironic thing, but this idea of a secondary self, the spiritual self, getting on the meditation cushion yet again, putting on the headphones to the music, to the ambient music that will open me up. All of the preparation is like climbing into a cockpit and being a very busy pilot. And the Buddha famously had been trying every technique he could possibly find, from severe bodily denial, asceticism, to more uh, sensory oriented practicing, opening to the senses rather than closing them down. Finally, one day he'd reached this location near the Bodhi tree. Famously, he said, "I'm not getting up until I wake up." And it is said that he just simply released effort. And in releasing effort to be awakened, he realized he had never not been awakened. But it wasn't just a conceptual thought, oh, I've always been alive and awake and liberated. It was a felt knowledge that our true nature is always here. We can't bring it into being. We can only prevent ourselves from seeing it. One of the great
Right.
ironies.
Yeah, or just like my looking for a teacher after I knew that I had been enlightened and awakened. And then about 3 years into working with the wolves, I realized, hey, they're my teachers.
Amen. I say that as a dog person myself. We could have another conversation about our animals and our owners.
Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about UFOs. I know that you became interested in them in the 6th grade, but obviously you've been studying this for a much longer time. So tell me about that path and where it's taking you.
Well, I'd be glad to. And I'll tell you, I'll start with the 6th grade, age 12, because it actually set the dials for how I've pursued this ever since. I did not set out to become a UFO researcher. I'm not particularly interested in science fiction, draw much more toward metaphysical fiction and spiritual fiction and fantasy and so forth, magical realism, as it's sometimes called.
Right.
Not a science fiction guy. In fact, I find science fiction rather boring, too technological, machine oriented. So it was my turn in the 6th grade to give a current events report. It was a great exercise that teacher did. Mrs. Lowry was her name. And I simply chose, I was living in Northwest Ohio at the time, when there was a famous nationally relevant UFO sighting going on in Hillsdale, Michigan. And it went on for several days, lights flashing, objects seen in the sky, credible reports of credible observers. And so I started to pay attention to that. That was going to be my current events report. And I gave a presentation on it in class. And what I specifically focused on, and I'm glad I can tell you this now, because it was something that I've continued to find early, as I went further along as a student of this phenomenon. The dynamic went like this. Ordinary people, credible people, good eyewitnesses reported remarkable objects in the sky. The various agents of official culture in science, news media, politics said, no, 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 no. Go home, people. That doesn't happen. That didn't happen. Misidentification, hallucination, hoax, etc. One Air Force consultant named J. Allen Hynek flew in to study this case. He held a news conference after talking with a lot of people, visiting a lot of sites, and he let slip a phrase that he came to regret. He said, I can't say overall what's going on. It's possible, however, that the one sighting of strange lights down near the marsh at the edge of town could have been swamp gas, which is a phenomenon of
Right.
luminescence that appears around swamps and bogs. He stood there mortified at this televised news conference as the reporters jumped up from their seats. And in those days, in order to call back to the news bureau, would get on a payphone and start putting in coins. And Hynek dismisses it all as swamp gas. That isn't what he did. That's what he was understood to have done. So it reinforced the idea the government doesn't want us to know. I found all that fascinating and brought it into my report. And one of my classmates said, well, do you think it was aliens? I said, well, that's what some people think. That's one hypothesis. I don't know if I used the fancy word hypothesis at age 12, but I said, certainly what they saw didn't resemble swamp gas. And they said, what do you think they saw, Keith? I said, I honestly don't know. And that wasn't me punting. I didn't know.
Right.
And it's okay not to know. That's how you find out something new. So at the end of the report, my teacher said, I think, and I can still remember her words, I think what Keith is saying is important to keep an open mind and ask relevant questions. I have never felt as seen or heard I had never felt as seen or heard up to that point as a young person in my life. It was almost a benediction or a blessing to have an adult say, as she went on to say, Keith, you have the makings of a journalist or a scientist or a detective. Keep up the good work. So with that kind of reinforcement, I simply continued to pay attention to this. And so that's basically my orientation.
Right. So let's go ahead, and I wanted to ask you, have you ever had an encounter or been in the vicinity of an encounter?
Not with, I've often said I've never seen a UFO. I've never seen anything in the sky that didn't seem to belong there.
Hmm.
Now, so I've never had a full-blown UFO experience. I have sort of learned to modify that in the sense that I did have in my mid-20s a near-death experience. Before the phrase near-death experience was popularized by Oprah and other popular TV and radio hosts, before the stages were made well known by Raymond Moody in his famous book Life After Life, 1 out of 20 Americans has had a near-death experience, and that's largely due now to the resuscitation abilities. People go to the edge of death and they come back. Well, I had an experience. We could talk about it in some depth if you want, but the point is, I had an experience of I was confident I had died. I had left my body. I was swimming in the ocean with friends, body surfing, and saw my body, saw my friends on the shore, and saw other sights that were consistent with the near-death phenomenology, the tunnel, the darkness, the wisdom figures, a reliving of my entire life and major events in my life from both sides. If I had a bad interaction with my dad, I not only relived that, I understood where he was coming from. I understood his conditioning. I felt compassion for him and compassion for myself, that no judgment. When you relive your own life in that kind of way, it changes the game board considerably. And like a lot of the reason I link this to the UFO phenomenon, and that they're both anomalous encounters. They're both involve encounters with beings. In my case, in the deceased persons that I had known when I was alive, people I didn't know. By the way, I saw animals, spirit bodies, spirit animals, even a mythological type figures. So if that was heaven, it's a pretty wild and woolly place. And I put the word heaven in quotes because I think sometimes we do ourselves a disservice by creating a picture called, well, is it heaven or not? Does it match up with this view of heaven or not? Try to put those ideas aside. And in any case, I learned when I came back and I told friends, they said, my friends on the shore said, we thought you had given it up out there. I thought, oh, good. I can be honest. I did. I did. I died and I came back. And I had enough lucidity in that moment, Julie, to realize this is not going to go well. This conversation is not going to go well because they're looking at me like I'm delirious. I'm actually quite present. I've never been more in my body and clear-minded than I am now. The hyper reality of the near-death experience is very much like the hyper reality of the alien encounter, which is very, very difficult for people. They tell people about it, like Whitley Strieber did, the famous author,
Right.
and you pay a price. So in any case, I know I feel a commonality with UFO people. Perhaps that's why I've stayed with the phenomenon as an author, because I had my own experience as something that I learned to talk about quite carefully.
Well, I had something. First, I'll say that most of my life, not right now, I've lived in very remote places, and that seems to be where they like to appear. And there were a lot of sightings around the time that, between the times that I was 8 and 12, so many that people called and they said they were weather balloons. But my father had a very close experience, and I had an odd one. We talked about Leo Sprinkle, who was a researcher. And when I talked to him, somehow or other, it all came back. But I was with a friend in the woods behind her house, and I love horses. And there was a corral with one was a pinto and the other one was a palomino pony. And I wanted to go see them. And for some reason, she was afraid and ran away. And there was this old house with a couple, and they invited me in and they told me they had chocolate chip cookies. So that was, I was going to go in and have that and see the ponies. And I can remember eating the cookies. And the odd thing is, I was doing a jigsaw puzzle with them, but it was like on the wall. But I realized years later the jigsaw puzzle was a map of different universes and our universe. And years later, when I was looking at the stars, that all came back. So anyway, at the end of it, all of a sudden, I was running back to my friend's house. Don't remember how I got out or how that happened. But I know I felt these people's love. It was profound. And my parents were calling me, and her parents were calling me. And evidently, I'd been gone for 2 or 3 hours, an amount of time that seemed like about 20 minutes to me. And then since then, when I lived high in the mountains, everyone saw them because nothing could just appear and then disappear behind a mountain and come back out. So,
Well, you've covered a lot there that are very common elements. I came in working on this book. I actually went to the library one day and checked out Grimm Brothers fairy tales in the original untranslated, translated from German to English, but unedited, because
right.
the Grimm Brothers tales were not written as literature. They were collected among the German folk, and they involve houses like you described. They involve encounters with non-ordinary beings, difficult encounters sometimes, Hansel and Gretel and the witch in the oven. These are metaphors for real experiences. It doesn't mean that the UFO phenomenon involves witches that are going to put you in the furnace. You've got to learn to think metaphorically. Those are energy fields, let's say. Energy phenomena that get concretized so we can materialize them and talk about them. And I think a culture, by the way, like the ancient German culture, that teaches, continues to share those fairy tales with children is a wise culture. Now, in our modern sensibility, we say, oh, we don't want to introduce such imagery to our children because they'll be traumatized. Well, you could argue that there's a trauma in removing that level of wisdom around warnings. You know, we have a time in our society now where children's names are on milk cartons. They're missing. We have a lot of missing children. And perhaps part of why that's happening is because children are not taught to be aware that the world is a big place. And there are aspects of the world, again, not that all of the paranormal or the ufological phenomena are dangerous, but there are most spiritual travelers, as you know, most spiritual teachers will talk about the difficulties of the Odyssey, the dark night of the soul. There are aspects of these encounters that are sobering. So, but the imagery you describe, especially the missing time, you know, the missing time.
Mm-hmm.
How have I lost 3 hours here? Well, that's a very common motif in the abduction, the alien abduction phenomenon, where people can't find 3 hours on the highway. They got back home and 3 hours have passed. And then over time, there's memories surface of encounters and attempts to suppress the encounters through memory. So, or what seems to be the case.
Right. I still think the thing of the star map and the different universes was just amazing. You know, it's like that. It's like imprinted in my memory. And I know those two people are still there. It's like every time I have a really hard time in life, I flash on them and I know that they're trying to help me in some way. And my whole life improved substantially after that. I mean, it was amazing.
I think that we underestimate the power of considering that there may be something that's actually a part of us, a larger part of us that wants to help us. You know, we're
Agree.
into this world with this mythology. You know, do it on your own, pull your boots up by your own bootstraps, self-made man, self-reliance. Listen, especially in the political realm, I'm a big fan of self-reliance. I'm not a fan of victim culture. I'm the way I am because my dad didn't do thus and so. Those are all relevant factors. But I am also a big believer that there are forces that are here to protect us and guide us if we ask for their help. Ask for their help. And then they show what the spiritual traditions call discrimination among spirits. And sometimes you'll ask for help. You might find a mischievous spirit. They say,
Yeah.
oh, help. Well, so listen to what don't make any major life decisions only on something that appears to be channeled. Take that into consideration. Compare it to other multiple ways of knowing is a big thing for me. I think that opening to multiple ways of evaluating information
Mhm.
and going with our gut and learning through experience. There's no other alternative.
Right. And maybe, you know, I came in with a subconscious memory of all those different galaxies or things like that, and being with them, put it in order.
Well, one of the most famous, really the first alien abduction encounter in the United States, 1961, involved a married couple, Betty and Barney Hill. I'm not going to go into great detail about it, but you can Google it. I do deal it with do address it in my book, The UFO Paradox. But it was a case in which Betty, in particular, said she was taken into a room inside this craft, a parent craft. I always have, sometimes I use the term apparent craft, a seeming craft, because we don't know at what level the craft is actually another kind of a space that we can't imagine. We call it a craft because it might be like a craft, but these encounters may involve dimensions that we are so estranged from that are
That's my thought thinking about it as they introduced me to a dimension that on some level I knew about, but they made me feel it.
So Betty also was shown a map, a star map. And
Yeah,
actually, it was evaluated at the time by a particular astronomer, and he said this could be Zeta Reticuli. I believe I'm not sure which star system, but he actually suggested that it could be a physical representation. In any case, it was a cosmological representation, a metaphysical representative of, if not exact solar system realms, then inner metaphysical realms. And by the way, we don't really know where one leaves off and one begins, do we? Where does metaphysics and physics leave off? What's the dividing line? When
I
we
don't
find
know.
today's quantum physics, as you know, sounds a whole lot like esoteric spirituality,
Right.
because objects don't exist until they're observed. Well, that's an interesting. I thought reality was supposed to be independent from us, but these
Exactly.
best experiments in quantum physics say there's a relational. Uh, we're related to everything.
And we are. So one thing that surprised me about your book was I didn't realize there had been reports about UFOs in 1947.
Yeah. Did you say 1947?
Was it 1947? Wait a minute,
You
I
mean
have it here in my notes. Or
what?
what? I don't care. I'm just asking what was the year that all these things began to be?
The reason I'm questioning what you're asking was because I wasn't quite sure. There actually were sightings in 1897.
Oh, wow.
So
No, I had no idea.
let me deal with those first. There were they were called airships, and this was before the Wright brothers had flown their famous flight at Kitty Hawk. So there were no craft in the sky yet officially, but it was like 4 years before that, or 8 years, and sheriffs and deputy sheriffs and upstanding townspeople in towns in Texas and Arkansas and so forth saw huge dirigibles and with rope ladders that would drop, and strange characters, sometimes they appeared human-like, would come out and give seemingly nonsensical answers, like, where are you from? The people would say. And they'd say, we're from Kansas, but we're heading back to New England tomorrow. Okay. And could I have a glass of water? Some very practical, pragmatic thing. These were reported in the news sightings at the time, in the newspapers at the time. But 1947 was when a pilot named Kenneth Arnold was searching for a downed airplane. He was from Idaho. He was in Washington State that day near Mount Rainier, looking for a downed airplane. There was a reward of $5,000, which in 1947 was a good payday if you're the one who found it. And nobody wants to find the downed plane. We all hope planes aren't down. Maybe they'll be found well. But in that case, he never found the downed plane. What he found was 9 objects flying in formation. Now, the funny thing about this is twofold. Number one, he never said they were shaped like flying saucers. He said they moved and skipped like a saucer would skip over water. But it became widespread that he had called them flying saucers. So people began to see flying saucers. 25 years later, maybe 28 years later, after his death, his daughter, Kim Arnold, came out with something very significant. She said, my father was always mystified by the idea that these were extraterrestrial machines made of hardware. He felt these 9 objects were living. The blue-white light they were flashing was of different densities. There seemed to be a permeability between them, within each of the objects. And he said they beat like the human heart. And my father told me, and he never went public with this because he already had enough problems, being the flying saucer guy. He did not want to say this additional, much more esoteric side, which is he felt that these objects, whatever they were from the realm that we will be going to next. And by which he meant the post-mortem world. It was connected with eternity, connected with resurrection, connected with transmigration of the soul, connected with spiritual issues. So isn't that ironic that even though he never identified them as machines, Kenneth Arnold's sightings were assumed to be machines in the sky, but in fact, they were far more like an esoteric phenomenon. If that full report had come out, if what his daughter revealed many years later, but what my father really saw, which did not comport with Steven Spielberg and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which is accurate in many ways too. But if that had been reported at the time, probably two things would have happened. Number one, he probably would have had to pass a psychiatric test to get his next license renewal as a pilot. But beyond that, it might have set a very different framework for the UFO phenomenon. To what extent are we on a wild goose chase by assuming that they are only hardware, when in fact there is a mystical, visionary aspect of this phenomenon that is the kind of stuff that you need to go to the deep religious literature to understand that in some sense these are extreme religious experiences of the kind that the Old Testament prophets had. That doesn't mean that religions as we know them are the best source to explain these, because religions become concretized and fossilized, and this is the truth and that's not the truth. But religious experience itself continues to happen. So are these a kind of deep religious, and by which I mean spiritual, mystical? Is the universe trying to teach us something? I actually say the answer is yes. I view the UFO as a metaphoric call from the cosmos. It's calling us
I agree
to
with
expand
you.
our maps.
Yeah, and we could skip to the Lakota and other indigenous tribes, say that the star visitors or UFOs have always been with them, that they appear during their deepest and most private ceremonies, and they exude energy to everyone. And the other thing that they told me is that these, let's call them spaceships, whether it's, an illusion or not, that they move with the mind, that wherever your mind focuses on, that's where they go.
I did not deal much with in my book on the indigenous stories. That may be another book in the future, but so you can't do everything with this subject.
No,
This
it's a
subject
huge
is so
subject.
big. People say, "Did you solve the cattle mutilations?" No, I'm not even sure. I think I refer to them in passing, but there are rabbit holes in this phenomenon. But I don't mean to say the indigenous stuff is a rabbit hole, because the indigenous people are saying to the UFO researchers, "Welcome."
Right.
People have been looking at this for a long time. Thank you for paying attention, especially for yourselves and for your children. Pay attention to this world. It's a more remarkable place than you know. But yes, these have been guiding our people from the beginning. But of course, their methods are not acceptable in the halls of what we call science today. Science used to be devoted to empirical research. The idea of not trusting the church's analysis of everything. The famous visits that Galileo received from the Vatican when he was reporting based on empirical evidence involving this device called a telescope. He was reporting, we kind of got this relationship between the sun and the earth backwards. We on earth are revolving around the sun, not vice versa. Got a knock on his door. It was the Vatican saying, "We'd like you to stop saying this." And Galileo said, "Well, you don't have to take my word for it. Look through my telescope." "We won't look through your telescope," they famously said. "And if you keep this up, we'll put you under house arrest." So the irony now is that the Vatican, the new Vatican, is the establishment of science. I'm not anti-science. I am anti-reductionistic science that declares entire realms of our existence off the charts, because that's fantastic. That's supernatural. I believe we live in a supernatural world. There are supernatural phenomena, not supernatural in the old-fashioned sense. One definition of a miracle, it's not that a miracle violates the laws of nature. It's a miracle in a traditional sense that reveals the maps of nature were complete.
Well, they're exceptional, because I can remember that in the 11th grade when I was taking physics, and I said, okay, I get how all this works. I get how to do the math. I get what you're teaching us, but all the things that change our world are outside of these formulas. And you can't explain any of these to me with the math that you have, or the little things that you have rolled down hills, or, all those things. I said, when will I get to learn about that? And he said, oh, we don't do that. Well, I hope someday you do.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the most interesting debates right now among professional philosophers when they gather at their conferences is the so-called hard problem of consciousness. And the reason consciousness is the hard problem, we can't square it with matter. Well, it's because the materialist premises of our science, physicalist materialist premises say that the core of reality is essentially dead, inert stuff called matter. And it spins around at great velocities according to mathematical precision, which, by the way, is interesting. Where does the mathematical precision come from? Is there an intelligence? But in any case, it's dead and lifeless. Purpose and meaning are not intrinsic to anything important. They come in the human realm later. So if that's the ground of being, then if dead matter is all we are, then at some point, matter awakes to itself and develops subjectivity, the ability to taste the sweetness of a cherry, to smell the beauty of a rose, to feel the pain of heartache. Subjectivity, the sense of I experienced this. There's something it is like to be in this moment, is something that we don't get out of categories like mass and spin and charge and so forth. These quantity, in other words, you don't get qualities out of quantities. So maybe the reason it's not really a hard problem after all, how to explain consciousness, maybe consciousness itself is the ground of being, that the one indisputable fact of our existence is that we are. We wake
It's
up and we
true.
know, I
Hold,
am.
hold that thought, and we're going to cut to break. I'm talking with Keith Thompson about UFOs. We're having a fascinating conversation, so please come back after our break. We're so glad to be with you today. Hello, everyone. We're back. I'm Julia Griffin. My guest today is Keith Thompson. We're talking about UFOs. We're trying to hit some of the points that you wouldn't normally hear in an interview, although I will say his book is quite complete and hits a whole lot of topics. But we're going to talk now, where are UFOs found? Is it the sky? Is it the soil? Is it the water? And I'll let you take over from there.
Well, they appear on all three. They come from the sky. That's the primary thing. That's why the extraterrestrial hypothesis seems so logical, seems so concrete. It has been reinforced by movies like Close Encounters of the Third Kind and The Day the Earth Stood Still. But it's still just a hypothesis because it's not as widely appreciated that these objects appear out of bodies of water, and they're seen diving into water. And most of this planet is water. So
Which is relatively rare. Most people don't seem to know that there are not very many planets that have water, and they think even in other solar systems, there's not a lot of water.
And the ability of these apparent craft, and I always use the term apparent because, for example, the ones that come into the atmosphere, very often it's not widely appreciated. Sometimes they do, so you can follow it from a long distance away, and it's coming in, and you're driving and you see that going on, which is often a prelude to the experience that is called abduction. I'll often put it that way, the experience that is called abduction, because it's a real experience. But what is actually going on in those experiences is really a big question for exploration. But very often these apparent craft simply appear like the TV set has just come on. They have a physical a location in place in space. They create turbulence. They create other artifacts that we would call physical. But then they do other stuff, like the single object craft will break into two or three, including light orbs, or they'll
Wow.
begin as two or three and consolidate as one. They will drop into the ground and disappear. They will disintegrate. They will disappear like a TV set going off in the old days. So this is a phenomenon that in many respects has features that are comparable to the paranormal in general. to mind matter relationships, psychokinesis, materialization. Are these a large scale materialization that are somehow connected with our consciousness, with our dreams? I think that there is a sense in which the abductees, in particular, the people who report being taken and experimented on, seem to have experiences that correlate with their own consciousness in some way, their own energy signature, as well as their own personal psychodynamics. If, for example, if you have a very rigid religious upbringing and you're very oriented toward the bad forces out there and the good forces that lie with God, so if you have that kind of division, and it's a good idea to bear in mind there might be bad forces. I'm not saying they're not, but if you
Right.
have a very rigid belief that my faith takes me to the good and what's not that is bad, then you will experience the abduction as bad news. But others experience the abduction as a kind of communion. The author, Whitley Strieber, named his famous book on his UFO experience, Communion, because he came to realize, yeah, it's not widely known, he was going to originally title his book Body Terror because the experience was so overwhelmingly frightening to him. And after he delved into it, and as he delved into it and began to have continuing encounters with the people, with those he called the visitors,
Uh-huh.
he and his wife decided, especially his wife Anne was the one who said, Whitley, don't call your book Body Terror, call it Communion. He said, Communion? You're in communion with something. You
Mhm.
are interacting with something that's teaching you, aren't you? And he said, well, yes, I am. Well, then call it that. From
I know. I was thinking about that when we were talking, seeing the horses and seeing cookies, that put me in such a great place of consciousness. I think that that's partially why it was all so good.
I think a big part of it is expectation, and who knows what other you know I'm pausing now because I'm going to have I could open this to a big topic. When Whitley Strieber and his wife Anne Strieber wrote, when he wrote Communion, they included in the book, if you've had experiences of your own, contact us at this post office box. They received thousands of responses. And so Anne and a research assistant began to pour through these handwritten, sometimes poorly written, not well composed, but direct experiences of I was driving one night and the
Right.
following happened. Uh, one day, famously, Anne came out of her study and said, Whitley, this has something to do with what we call death, because there was this sense of, for example, the abductees, when they are in these rooms that appear to be in the inside of spacecraft, very often there will be others who are there, including deceased persons they know in their life.
Oh,
So it's
interesting.
the new in their life. So is there an interface between, I actually think there is an interface between the UFO contact experience, the near-death experience, which involves absorption in light with beings that appear to be spirit beings, just as in some sense the UFO beings have bodies that are paraphysical. They come in and out of materialization, it seems. And then likewise, the after death maps. I think it's important to pay attention to the maps of the afterlife to get the largest picture of the universe in which we may be actually situated.
Hmm. And so one really good way of thinking of all of this is just like a big dimension of spirituality that hasn't been fully explored. And it's like all deep spirituality. Sometimes they're good beings, sometimes they're bad beings, but it is something that expands our consciousness.
Absolutely, and we live with a lot of experiences that we write off to coincidence because we live in a materialist culture, and that gets reinforced. If you dare tell somebody, for example, the phone rings, you go, "Okay, I'll go pick it up. The phone is over there." And as you walk across the room, you just suddenly have a flash of your friend Mary Ellen that you haven't heard from since high school. You're going to get in touch with her someday. Maybe I'll do that later today. You pick up the phone. It says, "Hi, Keith. It's Mary Ellen from high school. You remember me?" "Yeah, I remember you, Mary Ellen. Excuse me while I faint." These experiences are very common. We sometimes have
Well,
an
sure. I
experience?
mean, I do this all day long. To me, every friend I have and every person I care about, the phone has a different sound to me when it's
Mm.
that person. It's actually that way. And one way that I say this about coincidence and intuition and things moving through the universe, how many times have you looked in your purse or your briefcase for a pen that you know you put in there before you left? It's gone. You look again, here's the pen in your hand. That happens with money, checkbooks, cards, and they reappear. It's not a static universe. Everything is moving and rearranging itself. And that's when a big reason that higher consciousness is so important is because when you're on that level, it tends to rearrange itself with the more positive aspects of you in life.
Well, speaking of every day, ordinary experience, you're at the grocery and you don't know why, but you are aware that someone is staring at you. And you turn behind you, and it appears that someone is staring. Now, mostly what we focus on is why is that person staring at me? Especially if it involves men and women. There's a woman who's being stared at, or for that matter, it might be a really good-looking guy. The point is not why were staring, but the fact that we might know. And but this has been reinforced. This has been studied at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Northern California by a scientist named Dean Radin, Radin. I recommend his books on the paranormal. He's conducted experiments with staring, using closed circuit TV and all kinds of protocols to make sure that there's no sensory knowledge. The person, it's closed circuit TV from another part of the premises. In
Right.
any case, people have a statistically relevant signal. They know when they're being stared at. And so, what does that suggest? Well, it suggests what the Nobel Prize was given for just 2 years ago, the entangled photons. I'll just briefly say there's an experiment with a machine that sends two photons, light molecules in opposite directions, great distances. And there's a way to measure the photons as they continue traveling way apart from each other, showing an entanglement, a connection, that they influence each other's behavior. So is it that hard to conceive that at this level, the macro level, not the quantum, but the quantum level manifests here? But what's the difference here? I think the difference here, Julie, is that we have the capacity to be to be so absorbed in our consciousness in the immediate tasks of our life. What's going to happen to me today? A lot of me keeps us from seeing the realms in which maybe synchronicities are going on all the time. I find the more open I am to them, not trying to have them, but the more open I am to magic, the more it appears. And it's
Exactly.
probably the case if I'm in a rationalist debunker mode, it's going to be a pretty good interference pattern to ever keep the extraordinary from happening. Although sometimes it will happen to a rationalist and a debunker who is honest and open and says, "Well, I've just had my mind blown. I'm now open to the possibility that may be more to heaven and earth than we realize."
Yeah, and this is what I say is every morning, don't look at your to-do list. Think about bringing in light. Think about what's alive. Try to see the animals in the woods. Move out of yourself and into the world and see what happens then.
I have a good friend who recently who's a friend who's a birder, right? I've always had a picture of people who pursue birds and track birds and listen to birds as kind of nerdy people with binoculars and beanies or something. But in fact, my friend is a real serious birder, and so she has introduced me to birding. I now have an app on my phone where I can go out and record the birds. I find out which birds. Well, first of all, I don't need the app to appreciate the beauty of the
Right.
birds, but it's an assist, it's an adjunct. It's kind of nice to know. But then I put the phone down and I just say, okay, I'll listen to you. I don't need to know your species right now. I don't need
Mhm.
to know where you're from and where you might be migrating from. Although those are details that are worth knowing. The indigenous people know all of that.
Right.
They know where every star in the sky is. They're amazed when we finally see a pattern like the Big Dipper. They say, how do you manage not to see it? That's the more interesting thing to us. How do you manage not to see the Big Dipper? Not
Mhm.
how did you discover it? So anyway, I become a bird person and I find there are more birds than ever before.
Right. And I have noticed that nature does seem to be coming back, as odd as that is at this time, but there are definitely a lot more animals and birds than I've really seen probably since the turn of the century, which is
Well,
amazing.
speaking of nature, in the abduction scenarios, which involve the sense that you're taken out of your bed or you're taken out of your car, you're lifted, levitated in some cases, what appears to be you feel levitated, whether it's your subtle body, your astral body, your celestial body. The other traditions of the world have an understanding that we have multiple bodies, multiple sheaths of subtle matter. But in any case, the experiences of being lifted out of your body into a ship, and there are visions that are shown to the abductees about the future of the earth. Now, whether they're to be taken literally or not, there's a warning. It's a prophetic warning. Take care of your planet. Don't get too technologized. One 8-year-old girl was told. Technologized is not even the world, but that's the word she came back with. They're warning us not to get too caught up in all our machines and to realize that our Earth is threatened. Now, again, are those literal warnings? Well, there's a pretty good evidence that we need to take better care of our world. So, in some sense, is this a distant early warning system? These kinds of experiences to pay more attention to nature and to realize that we are part of nature. It's not just here as a resource for us.
No, and so much of our energy comes from integrated action with nature. Now, you were talking about abductions, and I know some people who are metaphysical say that the abductions are ending. Have you seen any data on that or have any thought about that?
That's a good point. I tried near the end of my book to get two of the major researchers. One has passed away, Bud Hopkins, and a researcher named David Jacobs is retired in Pennsylvania. Two of the leading researchers, John Mack of Harvard University, passed away about 20 years ago. So I don't know. It's kind of hard to get a sense. I'm told by people who are in the know, who take the phenomenon seriously, but are open-minded about interpreting it, that the abductions were a phase, and they came. Some kind of research reconnaissance was being done. Now, that may be news to somebody listening to this right now. Said it's not done for me. I'm having these experiences right now. So I don't mean to say that they're officially over and they're not happening, but there appears to be a view that there's been a
Yeah.
pause. There's been
And
a
then
pause.
some people who channel about this say that we're now encountering the space visitors or star visitors who are on a higher level, that they're trying to really help those of us who want to evolve by sending us energy, sending us ideas, that kind of thing.
It may be,
Protective presence.
John Mack of Harvard, the psychiatrist who got in a lot of trouble at Harvard, despite the fact that Harvard claims to favor, universities like Harvard claim to favor academic freedom. As Alan Dershowitz said, well, apparently at a school like Harvard, where you've got a college of divinity, a school of divinity, it's okay to talk about angels. You can't talk about aliens. So they nearly took away his teaching credential until
Wow.
they realized. In any case, my point about John Mack is that, oh, gee, what was my point about John Mack? And
We were talking about the higher dimensional
that he
star
said that
visitors.
maybe the abductions are a phenomenon for the metaphysically impaired, by which he meant maybe for some people, real hard medicine is, for maybe a large part of us as humans need the hard medicine of the abrupt, physically hard-edged experience called abduction. Maybe they seem to be going is maybe because this phenomenon is interacting with us at a far more subtle level.
Mhm.
So, by the way, that brings up a question. There's a major division in the UFO field that sort of comes down to this. It's not discussed this way. Most often it's discussed as it's either hardware, technology, something objective, physical out there, or it's something in here, psychological, spiritual. Well, first of all, there's no evidence that the abductions result from psychological impairment. This is not a psychological malady. Many abductees have psychological problems adjusting to that experience.
I would think so.
No big surprise, I would.
Yeah.
But so there's a division. And there's a division between, are these happening in the sky or are they happening in the soul, to the soul? My response increasingly is both the sky of the soul and the soul of the sky. There's something that is transgressing the very division that Western philosophy and science depend on as we formulate. The outside is matter and the inside is psyche. And we have a little bit of psyche. Somehow it emerged in all this dead matter. One day Shakespeare started to write sonnets and plays. How did that happen? If it's all dead matter, it's not. This is a
No,
lie.
it's all living matter.
Universe, but it's going to. We're not going to get there directly from mainstream science. But in any case, it's both. It's both something's appearing in the soul and something's appearing in the sky. And that's the kind of big picture view I take and can try to hold in this book, the UFO paradox, and hold the tension between this phenomenon that crosses the divide between mind and matter in ways that with all kinds of synchronicities. That's the other idea that comes to mind. We've all had synchronicities, like the phone ringing and knowing who it is, like thinking of someone who died. And there are other aspects of that that are clearly, well, they're present.
Yeah.
Sometimes we're aware of the dead present. I know when my mother passed, I was with her in the hospice and the room filled with presence. It was after my own near-death experience, and which I think had reduced my own filtering against openness to the dead. We have a great deal
Right.
of defenses, to death. We're very nervous about it because it sort of implies, well, I won't be here anymore. Well, maybe you're not who, I'm not who I think I am. Everything survives, in my view. That was, in any case, with my mother, the room in her at her hospice filled with what I can only describe as a sense of presence, murmuring. There was a sense of density filling the room. My mother's face softened. I believe they were coming
Yeah,
to escort her away.
definitely. Yeah, definitely. Um, One thing that I wonder, because we do just still have a few minutes here, we talk about disclosure, that we're going to have a disclosure, and then we have suppression by the government. Do both exist?
The thing about disclosure, I will first to say that my book is not primarily about the disclosure phenomenon.
Well, I know that. Yeah.
Yeah, as you know, because you've looked at it and you've read it. The book is not about this. Disclosure is the primary way we're talking about UFOs in the mainstream media right now, which I think
Right.
is positive. But the
I do
idea
too.
that there's a definitive disclosure that's going to come has been predicted for 8 decades at least. And
That's what
it
I meant.
causes us to miss the real disclosure. We're the disclosure. That these events happen is a disclosure. That we don't understand them is itself a disclosure. Is it willing to disclose our need to go deeper into things? Deeper explorations of things as they are. So the real disclosure is happening around us. And there may be that McDonnell Douglas Air Force or McDonnell Douglas Aerospace or Lockheed Martin has a hangar where retrieved craft are held and aliens are embalmed. That's widely believed, has
I
been
know.
for 8 decades. It may be true this time. So I don't write anything off, but I'm not an expert on that side of the disclosure stuff, which is very much like Woodward and Bernstein and the Watergate cover up. Look, it's clear the government hasn't been telling us the truth. We now know from the New York Times story of 2017 that there's been a government agency within the Pentagon to study the very phenomenon that they were ridiculing witnesses for believing in. So we've not been getting the main story from government. Surprise?
Okay, so why don't you tell our listeners where they can buy your book? And it's out now. So if you're listening to this and you're enjoying it, we are just going in by about 10%. There's a huge amount of information in this book and it's all fascinating. So why don't you share your website and tell our listeners where they can find your book?
Well, I'll start with where they can find the book, as we say in the book trade, wherever books are available. So if it's Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, or your local bookstore, I'm a big fan of independent bookstores. So wherever you find, there's an audio book, which I narrated, and an ebook as well. And then my website is www.thompsonatlarge, THOMPSON at large, spelled out.com, thompsonatlarge.com. Happy to hear from people. I can read the emails. I can't necessarily respond, especially to requests that I read entire manuscripts, but I appreciate the outreach because we're isolated. I mean, maybe that's not too strong a term, but we don't have the kinds of day-to-day connections that reinforce this kind of search. So if there's anything that I want my book to do is to empower you, listeners and viewers, to trust your own experience and to be willing to open to larger dimensions.
And emails are wonderful for us all to get. I mean, I just teach classes and I got lots of them, and they actually help me to understand how my information is coming through to other people and what's uplifting. So send them some emails, tell them that kind of information. That's something that's useful to all of us.
I've heard so far from people who resonated with when I told my story about my near-death experience and how I learned very quickly. Don't talk about this widely. This is not an easy party conversation because the near-death experience was not yet officially existent. I'm old enough to have preceded the near-death experience as a normal category. These days, if you say you had an NDE, it means you came back from surgery and you had some extraordinary, you went to the edge of death and came back because it wasn't your time. But at that time, I didn't. So I've heard from people who say, thank you for describing how you learned to keep your sanity about you and that you wouldn't do well by talking about this with the wrong people.
And that stays true. I mean, I don't let people who are on a lower level know that I know who's on the line, or I know they're about to drop over and see me and things like that, because it would just worry them. So everyone try to keep a balance with that.
I agree very much. It can imply too, whether you intend it or not, that you're special. You're a prophet. I'm a prophet. We are having special experiences. I actually believe these experiences are widely distributed, and we simply don't know that we are. As I say, we are the disclosure. These supernormal or exceptional human experiences.
I agree, but we're having so much fun that I'm going to have to end it here and tell everyone you can find me at onetrueself.com, onetrueself.com. I do a newsletter at least twice a month, sometimes 3 times a month. I offer free classes periodically so you can grow and awaken. And I'm offering awakening classes right now. So send me an email, onetrueself@gmail.com. And thank you so much, Keith, for being with us. Namaste.
Thank you for the invitation. It's been great. See you later.
Thank you for listening to the Power of Inspiration and Awakening Radio with Julia Griffin to master a higher frequency for a new state of mind. Join us next time as Julia takes us deeper into the memory of the moments of light where transcendence and enlightenment emerge. The memory of the jewel of consciousness is always lived within you to tap into waves of energy and create huge changes by imagining the beauty of the vision and desires that are hidden in the heart. Learn to find your way back to nature, beauty, and your own heart, which holds the secrets of your existence and future. To discover more about Julia's adventures, animal communication, and the teachings she brings to every show, visit onetrueself.com. That's onetrueself.com. That's ONE, trueself.com.